Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. A friend asked me for directions and wondered why there only seemed to be right turns, and also it seemed like it was taking him longer to get where he wanted to go. I had to remind him that I am so conservative, I have trouble even giving left turn directions when I'm giving directions. Then this is a word of caution. This is not a safe place for those who are easily offended by having their ideas challenged. This is broadcast number 66, and our friend and fellow EMNR members, that's Evangelical Ministries to New Religions, Rob Bowman is joining us to talk about John 1:1 and John 8:58. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of tonight's webcast. And here's Ronnie Boy.
Good evening from hot, sunny, and formerly inundated Florida, where we were using pontoon boats to get around. Not as bad as the place, not as bad as they had it in Houston, but it was interesting for a couple of days here. Our sponsor for this evening is World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone. World's End Theology Outlet. And we ask you to kindly go to our website sometime soon, maybe tonight even while you're listening, midwestoutreach.org. Click on the yellow donate button. And if you like our program, or if you don't, and you just like to annoy people with it, click on the yellow donate button and contribute as you feel led to, so that we can keep the Unknown Webcast going for you and for your friends.
All right, and we're not promising that God's going to give you great wealth if you do this. In fact, you may be more poverty-stricken as a result, but do it anyway. And yes. Ron, we have Rob Bowman, who I introduced a few minutes ago. I've known Rob now for quite a while. And I have to tell you, one of the things that Rob does is he tends to challenge apologists even. He has a good mind, but he also tends sometimes to take a contrarian stand on positions.
I disagree. No.
He's sort of a contrarian by nature, but that's helpful because if we don't challenge our ideas, how do we know for certain that what we believe is true? So that's good, and I like that. And in fact, we're kind of
so what you're saying, Don, is what you're saying is because he's a contrarian, you are more certain about what you believe.
Not always, because sometimes he knocks the. If I was a Mormon, he would knock the polish off my testimony. Which also can be helpful. And he also, I think one of the things I like about it is he did this just a few minutes ago. We're kind of having some fun at Joel Osteen's expense. The Babylon Bee, one of my favorite satire websites, had a thing on there about his driving his yacht through flooded Houston, passing out his Best Life Now books. But you were remarking, Ron, that there's been false accusations labeled against Joel Osteen and the flooding situation. And Rob pointed out, we don't really have to jump on that bandwagon because there's enough bad stuff in his teaching already. You don't have to add to false stuff about him.
Yeah, I mean, I was, I'm glad I stayed out of it. The Facebook frenzy, it's literally been a Facebook frenzy about Joel Osteen. And he's got a lot of crazy, weird stuff that he believes and even practices, perhaps. But, people were glomming onto this story that he was not letting anybody into his church, even though they were untouched by the floodwaters, when in fact, apparently, they're now showing footage that they really took in quite a bit of water. And by the time people got there to take videos, the water had subsided, but it was still pretty bad inside the building.
Wow.
So,
okay.
Yeah. It gives, I think if James was writing today, the Apostle James, he would say, tell us to be quick to hear, but slow to share.
Ooh, I like that. Quick to hear, slow to share. Yeah. You know what? We're going to have to get a new sponsor from there. All right, Ron, let's do our Golden Facepalm Award so we can move on and start picking on not
Picking on
picking on.
people. That's what we do here.
No,
we pick on people.
not picking on, picking Rob's brain. That's what we're going to do about John 1:1 and John 8:58.
Well, as you know, it is time for the Golden Facepalm from the Cannes Laughter Festival, or the Facepalme d'Or from the Festival du Cannes Laughter, the prestigious weekly award recognizing accomplishments of distinction in the fine arts of slanting the facts, spinning the story, and other assorted tomfoolery in connection with Christianity or religion in general. Now, you may have noticed, maybe this is what you use instead of Google Maps. Maybe you actually use the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate groups map. Maybe you use it so that you can show yourself where not to drive, who to stay away from. Lots of wonderful uses for the hate group map. And if you're ever going through Florida, you certainly want to avoid D. James Kennedy Ministries, formerly Truth in Action in Fort Lauderdale. Why? Because they are anti-LGBT. Now, I think that the Southern Poverty Law Center has a problem here, don't you? Where's the Q? I mean, are they anti-Q?
Anti-Q.
I mean, do they hate the Q part of LGBTQ? Anyways, not only was D. James Kennedy Ministries a little bit, just a tad upset about being named one of the 63 hate groups in Florida, but you'll notice some of these other, well, look, you'll notice they're right above the Stormfront, the white nationalist neo-Nazi group. And they're put in there with some anti-Muslim groups, but they're also on the same list with Muslim groups that have been identified as hate groups. And so D. James Kennedy Ministries was reported a few days ago that it sued the SPLC over this hate group map, and it turns out they're not the only ones. There are Muslim groups also that are very upset. Wow, this sounds like a really great story. You'd want to report on this, wouldn't you? Well, according to our friends at Get Religion, the Southern Poverty Law Center gets sued by Christians and Muslims, and hardly anyone covers it. Well, why would you if you're using the hate group map to write your own stories, which is actually what is going on here? I don't know. This was a couple of days ago. This is August 25th. There may be a few more covering it. Fox News was covering it, as Get Religion reported. In any case, this week's winner of the coveted Golden Facepalm Award from the Cannes Laughter Festival is awarded to the Southern Poverty Law Center and the mainstream media in general, the SPLC, for listing D. James Kennedy Ministries as a hate group because it supports the biblical view of marriage, and the mainstream media for failing to report on the lawsuit against the SPLC. And that, my friends, is this week's Golden Facepalm Award, which I know that's the main reason some people even watch our program, is just to see who we're going to award that to.
Yeah, award that too, yeah, exactly. All right. Now, Rob, Ron has specifically wanted to talk with you on this subject because you had engaged Jason Bidune and his book, Truth in Translation, which when we talked earlier today, you said was about 10 years ago you did this. So Ron cogitates things for a while.
I have medication for that, though. It really affects things you don't want to hear about. So, okay.
So we're going to want to talk about John 1:1 and John 8:58 specifically, but why did you get involved in a debate/discussion with Jason Bidune about his book?
You know, I don't remember what precipitated that exactly, but I do know that he and I had ended up on in a formal online debate over it on a Yahoo group. I don't know if you remember Yahoo groups. They still exist, but nobody uses them now because they use Facebook.
Right.
I ran a Yahoo group called Evangelical and Jehovah's Witness Theologies. And Jason joined that group, and we had, I think probably because some Jehovah's Witnesses contacted him, I'm guessing is what happened. Again, it's been 10 or more years ago. And so we had ended up having a very lengthy debate. When I say lengthy, it prints out to, I think, over 500 pages of material. So it was way too long. I spent way too much time on it, but there it is. But I learned something doing it, so that was worth something to me.
Yeah, it really was long. But you can search it. It's searchable text. And if you're looking for something specific, that is very helpful.
So that was about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So it was 2007, roughly. Okay.
Maybe before that even, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, Joy and I got involved with online discussions in 1992. Back in AOL's fledgling years, we got involved with America Online. And specifically to go into the discussion groups with Jehovah's Witnesses to dialogue with them. And that was a time when you could actually do fairly lengthy posts.
Yeah.
And they didn't know we were married because our writing styles are so very different, which made things kind of interesting. But you can't do that quite as much these days, these kind of lengthy laying out your case, discussions, debating back and forth. So
that's one of the difficulties with Facebook. It really isn't conducive to that. By the way, I looked it up, and the online debate I had with Jason was in 2004 and 2005.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So 12 years ago.
Well, I of course have not aged since then, but I have gotten smarter. Jason Bedun, we should probably just say a couple of words about him. He is he's a PhD. He portrays himself as a biblical scholar, and yet I have very closely scrutinized his CV, his curriculum vitae, which is standard. It's you need to, if you're an academic, you need to keep this up to date. It shows all the important features of your education, and it shows all of your publications and all of the classes you've ever taught. It usually including when you were graduate assistant at the graduate level, and you were doing research for other professors while still pursuing your own degrees. You have to show all of this, everything. If you have an adequate CV, and these documents can go on for pages. And I looked very closely, and yeah, there was an article in maybe I wish I had it in front of me. Maybe it was in the Journal of Biblical Literature on something in Corinthians. But everything else that he's written is all in connection with the Manichaean. The closest he gets to writing on mainstream Christianity is when he deals with Augustine's time among the Manichaeans and his connection to the Manichaeans. But everything else is Manichaean, which was an early heresy, a kind of a form of Gnosticism mixed with Persian Zoroastrianism. That is his specialty. That is his strong suit. That is what he is really, really good at. And apparently he's well respected in that field. But he seems to think he's also an expert on translation of the New Testament. What do you think about that?
Well, he did that book of his, obviously even more than 12 to 14 years ago. It came out well before that. So that was very early in his career. It wasn't a very good book. I'm just saying in terms of its scholarship, not so much in terms of its opinions or conclusions. And so I think that he's probably developed as a scholar since then. I know about some of his other work that he's done more recently, and he's become more of a recognized member of the guild, if you will, at Society of Biblical Literature convention events and things like that. One of the books that he did a few years ago got quite a bit of attention. But yeah, I think you're right in that he's really not a New Testament scholar. He's a scholar of early Christianity in the post-New Testament period. And that's not me making that noise, I don't think.
No.
And so that's really, New Testament studies and especially translation theory does not seem to be in his general area of expertise. And, In fact, much of what he said in that book, Truth in Translation, was, I'm sorry to say, quite amateurish.
Well, I mean, he made some really outlandish statements. For one of them, I noted before coming on that the standard translations going all the way back to the King James. I'm talking about the King James itself, the Revised Version in England in the 1800s, the American Standard Version, the Revised Standard Version, the New American Standard Version, the New International Version, the English Standard Version, down the list, all the way down. We have the Christian Standard Bible now. These are all committee translations. And especially in recent decades and centuries, these have been stacked with PhDs who just live, eat, and breathe the languages. And Badun makes this statement that, well, you know what? He actually says this in Truth in Translation. These modern Bible translations are all made by, retired missionaries and pastors, the guys who just, seem to have a lot of extra time on their hands, and they really don't know what they're doing. Well, you can go to the NIV's website. You can go to the New American Standard Bible and ask them, can you give me a list of your translators? And you can see where these men taught, where they got their own degrees. They're all PhDs, and they're all specialists in the languages that they translate. So where did he...
Right.
This was published by the University Press of America. Do they have editors there? Did they actually read the books before they print them?
Only minimally, I think, for that particular press. But, Badun is, I think, making a point from his perspective that anybody that is a conservative in his view of Scripture, anybody who takes an evangelical or fundamentalist or conservative Christian view of the Bible as the Word of God, is by definition not really a scholar.
You mean like the Jehovah's Witnesses? They take the Bible as the Word of God, and yet...
his book is very inconsistent in that regard, although I think he probably understood that their translation committee was not scholarly either. But he clearly had an axe to grind against traditional Christian beliefs, and that's really what drove that book. By the way, some retired missionaries are also Bible language scholars and linguistic scholars because they had to study translation theory in order to translate the Bible or to quote the Bible in other languages. So very often these people get involved in these committees because they bring a particular expertise to the subject that people who've never actually spoken a living language other than their native tongue don't have. So, it's a little bit short-sighted to dismiss people like that as not having something to offer.
Well, I agree. I totally agree. I just actually started compiling lists of translation committees, and you'll find an occasional former missionary, or you'll find an occasional gentleman who spent most of his career in the pulpit, but you've got University of Cambridge, University of Oxford, Aberdeen, and you've got very strong language background. These men, and you also have, in the vast majority of them, literally decades of classroom experience teaching the languages and writing and being reviewed in peer-reviewed journals for their articles. We're not talking the welterweights that Badun has made them out to be. He simply made that up. He simply created that factoid out of thin air. He did not know what he was talking about.
So for me, that would immediately raise a flag to say, okay, if he is so wrong on that issue, can I trust what he says on other kinds of things? For example, he seems to be of the opinion that the New World Translation is one of the best translations of the Greek scriptures.
Yeah, it's a very puzzling conclusion that he draws. But when you look at the test cases that he set forward, he had a preconceived conclusion he wanted to reach, and by golly, he got there. I mean, anybody that's going to test different English translations of the New Testament, and they're going to be especially concerned to criticize any version that supports the deity of Christ in passages like John 1:1 or Philippians 2, obviously has an axe to grind. I mean, if we're looking at what is the best, or what are the best translations in English that are available today, that are on the market today, you wouldn't look at just a handful of verses that you have a theological issue that you wish to pursue. You have a polemical interest, but you'd be looking at the totality of the product. You'd be looking at how well they do overall, and recognizing that there are verses here or there where people actually have disputes even among scholars as to how best to translate it. But that's not what he did. He came at the subject with an axe to grind, and grind it he did. So, it's interesting. The one criticism they made of the New World Translation, he reserved, as I recall, for an appendix, which was he criticized the New World Translation for using the name Jehovah in the New Testament, while applauding it for using it in the Old Testament, which of course was outside of his subject area anyway, which has to do with the New Testament. So he did ding the New World Translation on that one point, but otherwise, and I think that he also felt that the New World Translation did not use a gender-inclusive language enough. This has been a while now, but he was unhappy with that. But overall, he ended up saying that theologically, the New World Translation was less biased than these other versions, but he already knew that going in, because he had decided that any version that used the traditional translations of verses like John 1:1 or John 8:58 were suspect for that very reason.
And that means that he thought all of the committee translations that were produced by the ranks of PhD scholars were biased. And the reason why we emphasize this book in particular, and Jason Bedun specifically, is because this is a book that you will hear Jehovah's Witnesses reference. They have been informed of this book's existence. They are very proud of the fact that there is a man with an actual PhD, and this is like, the first time in 100 years or whatever that this has happened, who is actually saying that, yeah, you guys are right. We should translate John 1:1 as the word was a God. We should not translate John 8:58 as before Abraham was, I am. And he supports them straight down the line on every text that all the other Greek scholars are saying, no, these texts actually do support the deity of Christ.
Well, in the end,
it is helpful to have an actual scholar instead of like a spirit medium like Johannes Grieber.
That's a step up.
Yeah, was he the emphatic diaglot guy, or which guy was he?
No, he has the emphatic diaglot was Christadelphians. Johannes Grieber was a former Roman Catholic priest who had a spirit guide, would pass large illuminated letters past his eyes, and that's how he did his translation.
Well, if you don't have Urim and Thummim, what are you going to do?
That's right. Just bypass that medium and just get it directly.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, what matters is the evidence, and if the exegesis of John 1:1 or John 8:58 supported Jason Bedun's opinion, I would go along with it, but it doesn't. And there's a reason why all those cadres of biblical scholars who have translated the main versions we all know about disagreed with him. Yeah. And continued to do so after he had published his book. One of the interesting things about scholarship is when a book has a lot of traction and a lot of people pick up on it in the academic community and begin to say, okay, this guy's got something, then it becomes sort of worthy of attention in a way that it doesn't if it's just sort of sitting out there and nobody really pays attention except fringe groups like Jehovah's Witnesses. That's what happened to Bedun's book. Almost nobody paid attention to it except for them.
If you go, one of the things that I do is I go on the ATLA database, which is basically all the religious journals,
right.
And books too. And I look up to see what reviews have been made on a book. The other day I was researching a particular book, and it had a huge amount of reviews, and all of them were very positive. And I said, you know what, I'm going to get that book. It had to do with the Old Testament and archaeology, and it was a very, very good book. And I was able to get it used on Amazon. Well, when I looked up Truth in Translation, there were like 2 or 3 reviews, and they just blasted the thing to smithereens. I did not find a single good review of Truth in Translation. So right there, you have a clue. You'd at least expect 1 or 2. I mean, there are other liberals out there. There are other people with biases that are probably like Bedunn's. But the problem is that none of them are experts in Greek and couldn't comment on some of the stuff he's saying.
Yeah, the issue here is really that a good scholar treating the text of the New Testament, who isn't himself a Bible-believing conservative Christian, nevertheless can see, okay, this is what Paul said. This is what John wrote. I might not agree with it, but that's what they said. And I'll give you an example of a scholar that I think falls into that category, and that's Bart Ehrman. Ehrman is an agnostic. He does not believe the New Testament, but he straightforwardly acknowledges that John, Paul, and the author of Hebrews all called Jesus God, because he's dealing honestly with the text in terms of what it says, even if he himself doesn't believe it. That's the difference between a good scholar who's not a Bible-believing Christian and somebody like Badun, who's really kind of a hack, or at least at the time was a hack who had an agenda and didn't care about really dealing forthrightly and carefully with the scholarship on the subject. So, I want to make it clear here to anybody who's listening or watching that we're not saying that if you're not a Christian, you're not a Bible-believing Christian, you can't be a good scholar. Absolutely, you can be. That doesn't mean that you're right in your conclusions or opinions, but you can know what you're talking about. At least in terms of the book that Jason Badun did, 15 years ago, whatever it's been now, Truth in Translation. At the time, he really didn't know what he was talking about. He wasn't a good scholar in that subject.
Right. So you can bring a bias that will cause you to have a bad translation, or you could have a bias, to have a bad translation. So, for example, the Watchtower Bible Tract Society says, I don't understand how the Trinity can be true, therefore this can't be what it says. There must be a different way to interpret it. Right. You could come with a Trinitarian bias and try to read into the text. It seems to me what we want to do is go, what does the text actually say? And then our theology should be determined by that. So a non-believer, as you're pointing out, could do a great translation, even though they would disagree with it because it's a question of language. By the way, Bob Gray, former Watchtower elder, says that the WTS seems to have bought Debuan off when they gave him a couple of cases of their Kingdom Interlinears for a class he was teaching.
Yeah, apparently he likes the Kingdom Interlinear New Testament. I've heard that.
Right, which is really not their translation per se. It's a Westcott and Hort text, interlinear, and then their translations on the side.
Yeah.
So there's several cases where you can look at the Westcott and Hort text and see that it doesn't jibe with what they have done as their translation.
Right.
Yeah, we used to say that the Kingdom Interlinear translation was the best witnessing tool ever published for witnessing to Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, I love it. I have like 4 of them up here on my shelf. All right, we're going to take a fast break here, and then we want you to kind of lay out the case on John 1:1.
Sure.
Ron,
I guess that means it's time to hear from our good friends at World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone. And you know what? You know the problem. Men's hairstyles have gone downhill at your Kingdom Hall. And you know the reason. Everybody knows it. They're just not talking about it. The reason is because of misunderstandings arising from the recent New World Translation revision. What are you going to do? Here's the solution. Grease your head with classic New World Translation hair oil. This hair oil is based on the original earlier 1984 New World Translation of Psalm 23, verse 5b. With oil you have greased my head. New World Translation hair oil. You need the classic. It's based on the old light of the original New World Translation. the one that the Apostle Paul used, classic New World translation hair oil. Yes, we have enough problems already, let alone not greasing our heads properly. With oil, you have greased my head.
And we're back. Okay.
And we're back.
And we're back. I got distracted, which is easy for me to do,
Well, let's talk about John. Should we start with John 1:1?
John 1:1. Let's start with John 1:1. Now that we've kind of laid out the case for this book and why the Watchtower likes it, because in times past we've been able to have some effect, as Rob points out, the Kingdom Interlinear, the Purple People Eater, as the late Bill Centenar would call it, was very helpful in showing Jehovah's Witnesses that their translation is not a really good translation. And since the Watchtower published it, that was even more helpful. To be able to show them that, look, you have, you're citing Johannes Grieber as substantiating your translation. In the 1950s, he said, stay away from Johannes Grieber. He's a spirit medium. In the 1960s and early 70s, they're citing Johannes Grieber as a reliable translator until Bill Centenar wrote to them and said, why are you using a spirit medium that you used to say was a spirit medium and now you're saying is a good translator? And then they decided to say, oh, gosh, we just discovered he's a spirit medium again. So they're always searching for somebody to validate their translation because it just doesn't really seem to measure up. John 1:1, why or why not? Our translations generally say, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And they want to put in the Word was a God.
Right.
Now, is there...
I hear two things. When I talk to Jehovah's Witnesses about this, I hear two things. One of them is if I read my version, they'll say, well, wait a minute, how can he be with God and God at the same time? And to me, that strikes me as a rather odd question. It doesn't seem like that would be really difficult for God. It seems that the more difficult question is, how can you believe in more than one God? How can you have multiple gods? And that takes us down a whole bunny trail right there with Jehovah's Witnesses. The other thing I hear is, well, it can be translated a God. At which point I ask the person, have you ever studied another language, or do you speak another language? Are you aware of the fact that there are a lot of ways that things can be translated, but they would make utter nonsense or they would just be incorrect? And I provide them examples, but we don't have to go into those right now. So the question is not how it can be translated, but how it should be translated. And really, that's what the Watchtower is arguing, aren't they? They're not arguing it can be translated. They're arguing it should be a God.
Right. Well, it's kind of a two-step argument. Step one, it could be translated that way. Step two, it really needs to be translated that way. And that's kind of how they do it. Let me kind of give people a very simple, and for those of you who know a lot about this subject, understand I'm going to try to present this in as elementary a fashion as possible, kind of John 1:1 for dummies kind of a thing. The issue here has to do with the fact that the word in Greek for God, which we usually pronounce theos, appears twice in John 1:1. The first time it appears with the article in front of it, what in English we would call the definite article, but Greek scholars just call it the article because there's no indefinite article in ancient Greek. So there's the article appears before the word God in the second clause of John 1:1, where it says the word was with God. In that case, the word God, theos, the accusative form theon for the object of the preposition there, is translated God, and it has the article in front of it. The third clause, the last part of the verse, the word was God, doesn't have the article in front of it. And Jehovah's Witnesses, and they're not alone in this, but they're the most notorious for this, make a federal case out of the lack of the article in the last occurrence of the word for God in John 1:1. And they say, see, there's no article there. Therefore, it could be translated a God. And in fact, we say it should be, because otherwise it's going to contradict the previous statement, which says that the word was with God, because he can't be with himself. And that's basically the argument in a nutshell. Now, just to explain a little bit about what's going on here so that people can understand, and again, I'm going to try to keep this simple. The article in Greek is in some places used in ways that are familiar to us from English. We would use the article in the same context. But in many places, it is not used in a way that we would normally use it. It is often used in ways that are surprising to us. So, for example, in that very second part of the verse, it says the word was with God, but in Greek, it says the word was with the God. Mm-hmm. And we wouldn't normally do that. That would be unusual for us in English. We would normally just say the word was God, and that's how it's translated in every English translation I've ever looked at. If you run across the name Peter or John
right.
or whatever in the New Testament, most of the time, mm-hmm. it has the article in front of it. We don't usually say, oh, I went and saw the Peter.
Right.
Peter. But that's because ancient Greek used the article in ways that differ from the way we use it. So we have to keep that in mind. And by the same token, the lack of the article in front of a noun does not necessarily mean that it should be translated a or an, followed by the noun. In some cases, it can be, but not in all cases. In many cases, it doesn't make any sense, as Ron just said. Now, here's the problem. Nouns that we would normally, when we were reading in Greek, where we would very often translate it with the word a or an in front of it, are nouns that are common nouns referring to a plethora of things. So a horse, a chair, a man. These are all common nouns that can refer to all kinds of things. There's an potentially unlimited number of instances of those things or those persons. But there are some nouns in Greek that aren't like that are very often used to refer to one and only one thing or one person. And one of those nouns is God, or in Greek, theos. Numerous times throughout the Greek translation of the Old Testament and throughout the Greek New Testament, the noun theos is used to mean God with no qualifications, no explanations, no elaborations, it's just God. Many times with the article, because that's how Greek very often runs, and very often without the article. Now, look at John 1:1 to 18, which is called the prologue of John's Gospel. John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. The Greek word for God, theos, occurs 7 times in those 18 verses. 6 of the 7 times, it doesn't have the article. The only time it does have the article is in the first occurrence of the noun in John 1:1b. The word was with God, with the God. All of the other occurrences, it doesn't have the article. But in at least 5 of those 6 other occurrences, everybody agrees it just means God. So the word was with God, of course, has the article. But then what about a man sent from God? Verse 6. The people who believe in Jesus have the right to become children of God. Verse 12. They were born of God. Verse 13. No one has ever seen God at any time. John 1:18. These all obviously refer to God without qualification. They're not referring to a God or a divine being of some kind, but they're very specific. Yeah. But the only place in John 1 where in John 1 where Jehovah's Witnesses and others claim it doesn't mean God is when it's referring to Jesus.
And the weird thing is, Bedun argues in his book that, gee, if you see the word God without the article, you just automatically assume it means a God. And yet, half of the occurrences in the first chapter alone are without the article.
Right.
And the only time the Watchtower translates it as a God is in John 1:1.
Well, and there's a complicated grammatical argument that some scholars have used for saying that maybe something unusual is going on in John 1:1, and then Jehovah's Witnesses seized on that and turned it into something even more radical and turned it into a pretext to say that John 1:1 means that the word was a God, meaning a lesser divinity. But there's really virtually no argument about this among biblical scholars even to this day, that when John 1:1 says the word was God, it doesn't have a lesser meaning or an inferior meaning to God everywhere else in the passage. Now, there are a number of passages throughout the Bible, and again, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, as well as in the Greek New Testament, where we have very similar statements being made, where you have the noun God in the same case, that is the same spelling because it has the same grammatical place in the sentence, theos, appearing with a verb meaning to be, is or was or whatever, however you want to, whichever linking verb it is.
Mm-hmm.
And in all of those cases, there's a bunch of these, it means God. So for example, Deuteronomy 4, verse 35, this is God, and there is no other beside him. That's Deuteronomy 4:35. This is God, theos, without the article. For the Lord our God, he is God, Joshua 24:17. Philippians 2:13 has long been one of my favorite examples. This is where Paul says, the one who is working in you is God. Philippians 2:13. Again, theos, before the verb for is, no article. Luke 20:38, quoting Jesus, he is God, not of the dead, but of the living. Theos, without the article. And here's an interesting one. 2 Corinthians 5:19 is a little complicated, but the Greek is the exact same two words as in John 1:1. In Christ, reconciling the world to himself was God. Theos, ein, the same two Greek words in the same order as in John 1:1. That's 2 Corinthians 5:19. So my point is that the very grammatical structure and wording that you find in John 1:1 elsewhere in the Old and New Testaments in Greek is used to affirm or confess that the Lord, the one who saves us, the one who made us, the one who sanctifies us, etc., that he is God. And for Jehovah's Witnesses or others to argue that all of a sudden in John 1:1, it doesn't have that meaning, simply doesn't work. And I'll give you one other quick reason why it doesn't. John 1:1 is clearly echoing the words of Genesis 1, and specifically Genesis 1:1, to make the point that the God who created the world, the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1:1, that's the God we're talking about.
And he also uses that in two verses later in John 1:3. Right?
Yes,
Pointing
that
back
all
to Genesis
things came
1:1.
into being through him. There's a studied contrast in John 1 between the things that came into being through the Logos, through the Word, and the Logos who simply was there in the beginning. There's only one becoming or coming into a new situation that is talked about with regards to the Word in John 1, and that is when he became flesh. So he simply was, even before the world existed. He existed before the world. He is therefore eternal, but then he became flesh when he became the man Jesus Christ.
Well, go ahead, John.
Well, yeah, I do want to do this because since I deal with so many lay people, I have to try to make some of this understandable,
right,
at a different level. And so something that we use, and you can tell me maybe I'm wrong in using this because I clearly don't read Greek. I do go to Greek restaurants, and I like them very much. But we kind of did this. We said, in the beginning was the flame, and the flame was with fire, with the fire, and the flame was fire. so the flame or the word, the flame is an element's a bad term because we're talking about the Trinity, and he's not divided into parts or anything like that. But an aspect, the word is an aspect, is a one person of the triune nature of God. So flame
Say that again now. Can you repeat that?
Okay, yeah, sure. In the beginning was the flame, and the flame was with the fire, and the flame was fire.
Well, I think that does
kind of talking about substance versus.
Well, this is where we get into the qualitative use of
Right.
what's called the anarthrous theos, which
right.
theos without the article, and this is where it seems the majority of New Testament scholars have landed. The flame has the nature of fire. Can a flame be with fire? Yeah, it could. You could have a flame sitting on the ground. Maybe something has caught fire next to a burning building that is on fire. What are we saying? We're saying that the flame was there next to the fire. It was with the fire, and yet it partook of the same nature as the fire.
Yeah, now Don mentioned at the beginning that I'm a contrarian.
Yes, which is why I'm asking you that.
I did not know I was going to get an opportunity to demonstrate the truth of that.
Let's see it in action here.
But let me just point out, because I don't want this to rest on me, that the translation, the word was God, is found not only in the King James Version, but the Catholic New American Bible, the Evangelical New American Standard Bible, the New Jerusalem Bible, which is a Catholic version, the New Revised Standard Version, which is a mainline Protestant ecumenical translation, the English Standard Version, the New Living Translation, etc. I only know of one mainstream Christian publishing house's English translation of the Bible that doesn't do that, and that's the New English Translation, the NET, which translates the word was fully God. Which
what about the New English
NET, the New English Translation, which says the word was fully God.
What about the New English Bible? The what God was the word was?
I meant of the ones that are current. The NEB, and I think the REB did it too, but I'm not positive off the top of my head. The New English Bible had a complete paraphrase that said what God was, the word was. And if we go back further, we can look at Goodspeed and Moffat saying the word was divine.
Yeah.
But as far as these large committee translations that have been done, in the last, 40, 50 years or so, virtually all of them translate it as the word was God. And like I said, those are the big exceptions, leaving out such fringe
So what
groups.
you're saying is it's definite as opposed to qualitative? You're saying it's definite as opposed to qualitative?
What I'm saying is these translations render it as if it's just the regular noun God.
Right.
Now, here's the difference, just so people understand what this is all about. On the traditional translation, John 1:1 is identifying the Logos, or the Word, as God. It's saying the Word is God. On the qualitative interpretation, it's describing the Word, not identifying the Word. It's describing him as God, not identifying him as God. That's a rather subtle difference for many people. It's kind of a subtle difference for me, but it's claiming that John 1:1c is a description rather than an identification. Here's the problem that I have with this. There are hundreds and hundreds of uses of the noun God throughout the Greek Old Testament and of course, hundreds of them in the New Testament. This is the only verse in the Bible where anybody has suggested a so-called qualitative translation of theos as fully God, divine, God by nature, et cetera, et cetera. It's the only place anyone's ever done it. I find that very puzzling if this is a standard usage of the language for ancient biblical writers, or ancient Greek writers in general. I'm not aware of anybody ever producing an example of this from Philo or Josephus or other Jewish writers or early Christian writers like Clement of Rome or Clement of Alexandria or Irenaeus. John 1:1 seems to be the only example in the corpus of ancient Greek literature.
Well,
that makes me skeptical that we should translate John 1:1 in that way.
You do have origins discussion.
Yes, but I'm glad you brought that up, because now that's moving a couple of centuries later, and it is essentially arguing for an indefinite interpretation of John 1:1 as saying that the Logos was a second God.
Sort of. I mean, Origin,
I think that's basically what he's saying.
He seems to be saying more of a subordinationist view as I see it.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at here is I don't think he's interpreting it grammatically as a descriptive use of the noun. I think that's a modern invention. I haven't seen that in any ancient or medieval interpreter of John 1. Anyway, this is really getting into the weeds. The point I want to make here is that the standard traditional translation continues to be used by new English versions like the NRSV and the ESV and the Christian Standard Bible, the CSB, which used to be called the Holman Christian Standard Bible. They continue to use it, and I think the reason why is because they recognize that seems to be the best rendering. And what I would say is this. I don't so much object theologically to the translation of the NET, the word was fully God, as I think that it's an over-interpretation of the language. It just means God. Mm-hmm. And if you look at these other references that I gave earlier, like Deuteronomy 4:35, that's what it means. It just means God.
Has there been much discussion of the idea that theos is being used as a proper noun?
You know, that's a good question, and there hasn't been enough attention given to that, because it could be used as a proper noun, and very often is. We very often see theos as the subject used with an article, but when it's used as a proper noun and as a predicate, it might appear without the article and still be used as a proper name, and that could be the point. In other words, we could paraphrase John 1:1 like this: in the beginning was the Word was with God, that is the one we commonly know already as God, and the Word was, his own name was God. In other words, the Word's name was also God. He was, that's his name. And that is a very, very plausible interpretation of John 1:1.
Now, so I just want to do a quick recap, and then we're going to do a short break, and then we're going to go to John 8:58. So that's our directions. The quick recap is this, and I think this is an important takeaway, is John is pointing you back to Genesis 1:1.
Yes.
And he does that in John 1:1 and John 1:3. That whole section is taking you back to Genesis 1:1, which tells us that God created everything. In John 1:1-3, he's saying the Word created everything. If it exists, he created it. If he didn't create it, it doesn't exist. So that's important stuff, because it's telling you that it is God, very God of very God. And right. Secondly, John, if you want to put a in there, you have to then say, was John a polytheist?
Right.
He was not a polytheist, and so he wouldn't put it just a God, because he doesn't believe in multiple gods.
That's right.
Right.
Well, so. I also like to point out that the simple fact is that the idea of translating the anarthrous, that is theos without the article, the anarthrous theos as a god, is extremely rare in biblical literature. This is pointed out by Daniel Wallace's grammar. It's also pointed out in the latest Zondervan exegetical commentary on the Greek New Testament Gospel of John volume. It's rare, and you need a very good contextual argument for translating it with the indefinite article, and they just don't have a good argument.
Yeah, somehow, if the Logos is eternal, uncreated, and the one through whom all things came into existence, the source of life and light, spoken of in Genesis 1, to say that, then turn around and say that means he's a lesser divinity, it just doesn't work.
And
All right, Ron, break time.
Yeah, break time. So I'm going to hold my place there and come back to it after this break, after we hear from our good friends at World's End Theology Outlet once more, who have a question for us. That question is, lately, have you found yourself fondly reminiscing about years ago when the Jehovah's Witnesses who came to your door would relieve you of the fear of hell, only to turn around and threaten you with Armageddon? Or if you're a former JW, and if you are a Jehovah's Witness, do you miss the day when God's organization would let you get your fire and brimstone on by harassing your neighbors with threats that their complete destruction was right around the corner? Well, now you can relive those glorious days with our Watchtower Society Armageddon calendars. We are making them available on a clearance sale this week. Recall the relief you felt when, once again, God's organization completely dropped the prophetic ball. There's a complete satisfaction guarantee, which is more than we can say for the original predictions. The Watchtower Society Armageddon calendar is available this week from World's End Theology Outlet. So, what I was going to say was, I hear this argument that the idea that he is the eternal God, that he's with God, and that there is this thing called the Trinity is just too much for me to comprehend. It's just impossible to believe because I can't understand it. I hear this a lot. It is unreasonable. It is not comprehensible. Therefore, it is not to be believed. I don't know how many of you have encountered this argument. Or they'll come out and say it's a contradiction, and I'll say, well, wait a minute. A contradiction would be saying the word is God and the word's not God. That's a contradiction. Saying he's with God and was God, that's not a contradiction, not in the formal sense of the word contradiction. It's difficult. It's hard to understand.
Yeah, I'd call it a paradox.
Yeah, it's difficult. So I wish I'd kept this article. I've sorted through my library countless times looking for it. There was an article in the 1980s in a Watchtower magazine where it was relating the experience of a Jehovah's Witness worker who was recalling his years of experience in publishing kingdom truth, so to speak, door to door. He came across a man who asked him when God was born. When was your Jehovah created? When did he start? And he says, well, he never did. And the man says, well, that's ridiculous. And so he opened the Bible, his own Bible, to Psalm 90, where it says, from everlasting to everlasting, from eternity to eternity, you are God. And the man says, oh, that's unfathomable. I can't understand that. And the Jehovah's Witness said to this man, it doesn't matter whether you can understand it. It's in the Bible. You've got to believe it. Okay. Suddenly, I mean, this was an argument that the Watchtower promoted in an article in its own magazine.
You can find the same argument in their handbook, Reasoning from the Scriptures.
Right.
They use the same argument in that book.
In other words, right. we're supposed to subject our minds to the Word of God, even if it's incomprehensible to us.
Right.
Hey, so, I like your bringing up Psalm 90, verse 2, because it makes a nice transition if we're going to talk about John 8:58.
Let's talk about it.
Let's talk about it.
And you're going to help us with that transition, right?
I will. I know you people are going, what, Psalm 90, verse 2?
We're waiting with bated breath. Rob.
Yeah. All right. Well, John 8:58 is the other verse that we were going to talk about. Maybe we can do that quickly here. John 8:58 in most English Bibles says something like this: before Abraham came into being, I am. And you'll find some version of that in most English versions, in most English translations. In the New World Translation, and in a couple of other even more obscure versions, you will find something like this. Before Abraham was born, or before Abraham came into existence, I have been. And there are some variations on that. Now, why do Jehovah's Witnesses translate the Greek words there, ego eimi, as I have been rather than I am? Well, they have a grammatical argument, but their real reason for doing so is because translating it I am certainly smacks of a divine claim, that Jesus is claiming to be the eternal one, whose existence timelessly antedates that of Abraham, which is how most Christians have historically understood John 8:58. So that is the issue. Does John 8:58 properly translated say, before Abraham came to be, I am, or I have been, meaning I existed for some period of time before Abraham, so I'm older than Abraham, but I'm not eternal. That's how the Jehovah's Witnesses interpret this. Now, just to give people a real clear sense of what this would be like, that statement, the way Jehovah's Witnesses interpret it, could have been made by the angel Gabriel. Gabriel or Adam after he was resurrected. Anybody who existed before Abraham, including Gabriel, any of the angels, any of the Genesis patriarchs before Abraham, Moses, not Moses, but Noah, and all those people before Abraham, any of those persons could say, before Abraham came into being, I existed. Is Jesus only making that claim? Is he claiming only to be older than Abraham? In the context, clearly not. Because if you claim that you're older than Abraham, Jews will say, you're off your rocker, dude, and they'll just ignore you. They didn't do that. They picked up stones to stone him, John 8:59 tells us. Why did they do that? Because they believed that Jesus' statement was an expression of identifying himself as the eternal one, of claiming to be God. And that is how most English translations and other language translations, by the way, have understood John 8:58. So that's the real issue. Now, I mentioned Psalm 90, verse 2. Without getting into all the grammatical rigmarole, let me just read Psalm 90, verse 2. And specifically here, I'm going to be reading it in an English translation of the Greek version that would have been familiar to the Apostle John, who's quoting Jesus in John 8:58. So this is the Greek Old Testament. In the Septuagint, it would be Psalm 89, verse 2, but in English Bibles, it's Psalm 90, verse 2. Here's what the psalmist says. Before the mountains came into being, from everlasting to everlasting, you are. Now, in the Hebrew and in English Bibles, it says you are God. But in the Septuagint, in the Greek Bible, it says, before the mountains came into being, before anything else happened, from everlasting to everlasting, or from eternity to eternity, you are. Now, this is exactly the same words, the same key words, and exactly the same Greek tenses as the key words in John 8:58, except it's third person, or a second person speaking to God rather than the first person as Jesus is speaking in John 8:58. Other than the fact that one is in the first person and the other is in the second person grammatically, there's no difference. So what Jesus is saying in John 8:58 is comparable to what the psalmist says to the Lord Yahweh or Jehovah in Psalm 90, verse 2. Before the mountains came into being, from everlasting to everlasting, you are. Meaning, of course, that Jehovah is uncreated. And, of course, Jehovah's Witnesses use Psalm 90, verse 2, as Ron pointed out, all the time as a proof text for the fact that Jehovah is uncreated and eternal. And they're right to do so. That's what Psalm 90, verse 2 means. But by the same token, that's what Jesus means in John 8:58.
Yeah, I'd also point out that, Jehovah's Witnesses like to jump on the fact that ego eimi is not an exact or comprehensive translation of Exodus 3:14, where God gives his name to Abraham as I am in Hebrew. I am who I am. It's translated into Greek as something that means I am the being in the Septuagint, ego eimi haon.
Right.
However, if you go to Isaiah, there is this repeated phrase. It reads, I am he, in the vast majority, but maybe all of our English translations. Over and over again, Yahweh, Jehovah says, I am he, I am he, I am he. And when
that
you
is translated in the Greek, but translated in the Greek Septuagint as
ego eimi,
yeah,
exactly.
exactly the same
Ego,
words. Yeah,
the exact phrase that Jesus used is repeatedly used as God's self-designation
now let me
in the book of
clarify something
Isaiah.
because some people don't misunderstand. And I know you're not saying this, Ron, but some people might misunderstand. The Greek words ego eimi, or in English I am, don't always mean I'm God. They're not always
No,
affirmations of
no,
deity.
no.
But in the contexts in which Jehovah uses them in Isaiah 40 to whatever it is, 54, repeatedly uses it there, and in the context in which Jesus uses it in the Gospel of John. These are expressions of divine power, authority, saving work. Jesus is making the same kinds of claims throughout the Gospel of John that Yahweh or Jehovah makes in Isaiah with those same kinds of ego eimi statements.
Right, and the thing that distinguishes them from the normal use of the phrase ego eimi, or the clause, I should say, is that there's no complement. There's no I am green, or I am eternal, or I am whatever. It's just I am. It's just laid out there in the Greek. I am. It's called an absolute use, and so this is not something that's just you have to strain out of a relationship between one little verse in the Old Testament and John 8:58. There are multiple verses. Psalm 90 verse 2 is a good case in point, and the verses in Isaiah, plus the original Hebrew of Exodus 3:14. All of that is brought to bear. And you're right. I mean, why? There is no case. You cannot find a single case in all of recorded Judaica, of Jewish history, where somebody was threatened with stoning for declaring his pre-existence, that he'd been around since before Abraham. Yes, maybe locking him up as a crazy individual. There is no biblical authority for stoning somebody who thought he pre-existed. There is nothing. There's no Levitical law, no halakha, no nothing. And so there's no explanation for why the Jews sought to stone him.
Jehovah's Witnesses' best attempt to get around this point has usually been, well, the Jews misunderstood Jesus. Now, this is the same Jesus that they, when they're not paying attention to this issue, describe as the master teacher, the master communicator, the person who was so skilled at making his point known. But for some reason, Jesus struggled for 3.5 years or whatever it was to get the Jewish authorities to understand that he wasn't claiming to be God. So it happens in John 5, it happens in John 8, it happens in John 10, and even in John 19, verse 7, the Jews still want to kill him for the exact same reason, because by claiming to be God's son in the unique and divine way that Jesus was claiming, he was claiming equality with God. And so the Jews in John 19, verse 7 said, we have a law, meaning, of course, the Mosaic law, the law of blasphemy in the Mosaic law. And by that law, this man ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God. Well, that's the exact same claim that Jesus made in John 5. They wanted to kill him for that. It's the same claim that he made several times in the past run up to John 8:58. He was making the same kind of claim. In John 10, it's explicit. He claims to be the Son of the Father, and he says, I and the Father are one, which is an allusion to Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Mm-hmm. And so and they want to stone him for that, and they explain it. Being a man, make yourself out to be God. And then John 19, verse 7. So for some reason, throughout all these seasons of Jesus journeying to Jerusalem and interacting with authorities there, he never could find the words to say, guys, I'm not God. I'm just an angel. Right.
Yeah,
Put the rocks down.
How do Jehovah's Witnesses explain Thomas's declaration, which uses the definite article, ho kurios mu kai ho theos mu, my Lord and my God? How do they try to get around that?
Well, I've heard at least 3 different explanations from Jehovah's Witnesses over the years. The one that they seem to like now, which is probably in terms of the language, the word and context, the worst possible interpretation is that when Thomas said, "My Lord and my God," my Lord was directed to and referring to Jesus, and my God was directed to Heavenly Father, God up in heaven, Jehovah, the Almighty. So somehow Thomas is addressing two different persons when he says, "My Lord," Jesus, and "my God," Jehovah the Father.
But didn't John himself record Thomas as saying he said to him, that is
Yes,
Jesus?
right.
It's a pity that John couldn't get that right, don't you
Well,
think?
he should have said he answered them, I guess.
Yeah,
It isn't a very plausible interpretation. Let's put it that way.
let's put it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, the reason why that they have to do that is because the traditional and obvious interpretation is unthinkable to them for the reason that you've explained. They can't wrap their head around distinct persons in one God. But there we have it again. We keep running into this. John 1:1, the Word was with God, but he's also God. John 20:28, Jesus, who has already referred to the Father as his God, is now honored by Thomas as his God, my Lord and my God. So we have a person, Jesus, who is described in the same context as the Son of God and as God. That's just the kind of thing we ran into in John 1. This happens throughout the Bible. After you've been hit on the head half a dozen times or so, you ought to start thinking maybe there's actually something there.
Right. That's exactly right.
And that's where I really think Jehovah's Witnesses' approach to the Bible ends up falling down, because they keep running into paradoxes in the New Testament, and they keep saying, it can't be, it can't be, it can't be, it can't be. But folks, it is.
Well, it is. And, it strikes me that most of the cults and false religions make their mistake virtually at the same place. They just go in different directions. And that is the hypostatic union. They can't really understand how Jesus can be fully God and fully human. And so for a Jehovah's Witness, they go, well, he can't be, therefore he was just a man who used to be an angel.
Right.
Mormons go the opposite direction and go, well, okay, he's God, and we can be too.
Yeah.
Right? So it's the same place. They just go in different directions with this.
Yeah.
And in part, I would suggest it is because they tend to think of God in more Greek God terms. In other words, he's just like a really large-scale human. Therefore, he can only do stuff that large-scale humans can do. God can't really do stuff that God could do.
Well, you're making a good point here, because, in fact, Jehovah's Witnesses, like Mormons, believe that God the Father is an embodied being. Now, in Jehovah's Witness thinking, it's a spirit body, whatever that means, but he's a discrete, finite, embodied being who occupies space in some fashion, has a shape, and he has a single body. So they when they hear the Trinity, they think you're talking about like somebody who's got a split personality or schizophrenia, or he's got three personalities in his one body. That's how they think of this, because the idea of God as an incorporeal, transcendent, pure spirit doesn't even enter their mind.
So they deny his omnipresence?
Yes, or at least qualify it in a way that allows him to make his presence, quote unquote, known and influence everywhere, but he is not personally present everywhere. Both of those religions deny that idea.
So Solomon was just off his rocker when he said the heaven of heavens cannot contain you.
I don't know how what Solomon said can possibly be true if God is an anthropomorphic being of finite size. That just doesn't compute.
And they deny his omniscience too.
Jehovah's Witnesses explicitly do. Mormons actually affirm that God is omniscient now. He didn't always used to be, but he is now.
So the Jehovah's Witnesses don't have a God who comes anywhere near looking like the God of the Bible.
No.
This is a very important point. We're not talking about a theology in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses that is like ours, a view of God that's like ours, minus the Trinity. That's not what we're talking about.
Right.
It's a very different conception of God all down the line.
And it's very subject to human reason. It has to fit into my little pea-sized brain. You know, my brain compared to the cosmos that God created is barely a molecule. And yet somehow I'm supposed to fit the creator into it. And if he doesn't fit, well, then I just cut him down to size.
I can sympathize, because in my early Christian years, I really struggled with a lot of things in biblical Christianity that didn't make sense to me, especially in the first year. And I had a Christian friend who told me, look, if the Bible is the Word of God, you're going to run into things in that book that are going to be hard for you to understand. If it's the word of man, it might all make sense because it's just another person's opinion and you can kind of, go with it. But if this is the word of the transcendent creator of the universe and it talks about his nature, you're probably going to run into stuff that you're going to say, I don't understand how that can be, because it's God. And that really helped me.
I also think there's an element of some people have too much time to cogitate these matters. And here's what I mean by that. We have watched even Orthodox scholars wander off into heresy trying to explain the mechanics of how God does stuff. For example, Murray J. Harris, and I keep going back to this, at one point essentially denied the resurrection, not overtly, but because he couldn't quite understand how the nature of the resurrected body works. And so he decided it was a bodily resurrection, but it wasn't physical. It was a non-physical, non-tangible, non-corporeal body. Well, there's no such thing. So his attempts at explaining the mechanics of how it works brought him to a place where he actually was denying the biblical teaching on this issue. And I think a number of issues tend to go that way, as if you have way too much time to think about how God does stuff, you likely, in trying to explain it, are going to get into heresy.
Yeah, I think Harris moderated or qualified his view to such an extent that it almost became, giving back with his right hand what he'd taken away with his left. But and I say that because if you compare Murray Harris's view of the resurrection with Jehovah's Witnesses' view, it turns out they're quite different. So I don't want people to get the impression that he was saying the same thing that Jehovah's Witnesses do. According to Murray Harris, Jesus is still human. He's still he's still male. And various other things that he said, which surprised me when I first heard what his view was. So I think, and this is the really crucial difference. In Harris's view, the body that Jesus has is the body that was laid in the tomb. That body was not dissolved into gases or destroyed or something like that, but it was transformed into the form that it now has. But it's the same body. It's still a human body. It's still him. So whereas Jehovah's Witnesses notoriously think that God simply shattered the physical body of Jesus into gases or something and recreated Jesus as an angel, Murray Harris never came close to an idea like that. He did not. I'm not saying we shouldn't be properly and judiciously critical of what Murray Harris came up with, and I am, but just to make the point that it's not quite or not even really close to the view that Jehovah's Witnesses take. But you're right, we need to be careful as we examine what the Bible teaches on these things. If we're going to deviate from what traditional Christianity has historically taught, we need to be real sure we know what we're doing, because that's very good. Now that's dangerous.
We have run over, and I expect that we probably would do that because it's a really fun and interesting topic for us.
Great. We are so happy to have you, Rob. We
are, and Bob Gray, my good friend Doc Bob, former Watchtower elder, really recommends your book, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jesus Christ and the Gospel of John,
which I have and I recommend as well. There it is.
There it is.
There's an early copy with the original cover. So yeah.
Wow.
Right. So people want to get that. Now, if they want to contact you, how would they go about doing that?
Our website is at the Institute Search is IRR.org. That's I2Rs.org. And we have a contact page there where they can get a hold of us.
Okay, so that's that. Now, I could be mistaken, but it seems to me you're going to be in about a month at the Witnesses Now for Jesus convention
I
in
am.
New Ringgold.
Yes.
So you're going to be stuck with me and Joy up there as well.
That'll be fun.
and others, if you are tuning into this and it is before October, I think it's 5 and 6 of 2017, you're going to want to make plans to go to the Witnesses Now for Jesus convention. It's a great time, and you can get stuff on our website or look up, just do a internet search for Witnesses Now for Jesus convention 2017, and it'll take you right to their website. So. Rob, thank you for being with us. Ron, as always, it's been fun. We're working on what we're going to do next week, but probably we're going to do something on Christian astrology with my friend Marcia Montenegro, if we can figure out how to make the technical stuff happen for her.
And now for something completely different.
Yes,
And now for something completely different.
Very different. So should I walk us out, Don?
Walk us out of here, please.
Okay, well, you know what? We have to give credit where credit's due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polly Gummas. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lou C. Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance comes from Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. And our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Director of Privacy Assurance, Wiretapping, and Original Idea Sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, who are solely responsible for its content, but you'll never prove that in a court of law. If our
Rob,
Dewey, Cheatham & Howe people can help it.
They can handle that for us. Rob, thank you for being with us. Ron, we will talk to you next week. I hope you can canoe for those who remember that ad. I noticed your streets were just flooded the other day. So
yeah, we had a river running through this neighborhood here.
Okay. All right. Talk to y'all later.
Thank you.
Bye.